what is the original ship of Theseus when it comes to fan fiction? Is the new boat stealing? Is the new boat stealing? Like, truly though, like
is the new boat copyright infringement?
Exactly. Or is the original boat with all of the old parts good if it's deteriorating and dying on sea? Anyway. Welcome to the Gifted Child Symposium, a podcast committed to uplifting underrepresented voices and challenging the ways capitalism disparages contemporary artists in marginalized spaces. And by underrepresented voices and marginalized spaces, we are of course referring to the unsung heroes, the Shakespeares and Homers of our time, fanfiction authors. I'm Mijin.
I'm Felicia, and welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series on fanfiction. So in the last episode, we focused on the experience of reading fanfiction. This part 2 is focused more on the act of creating fanfiction. So if you missed our last episode and you're interested in hearing more about the background of fanfiction, like where it originated, what function it serves within a fandom and within fan communities, and why we love to read it from a psychological and philosophical perspective, check out our last episode. It's out now on Spotify and wherever you're listening to this current podcast. But yeah, again, to reinitiate people who are unfamiliar with fanfiction, let's just do a quick intro to it again.
Yes, so to reiterate, and I quoted the same thing in the last episode, Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines fanfiction as, and I quote, stories involving popular fictional characters that are written by fans and often posted on the internet, end quote. So it is, as we explained in our last episode, this, but also more. Fanfiction is wide, multifaceted, and a complex practice and medium. And what we are here to discuss and defend is that fanfiction is not just like poorly written smut about two characters who never meet, you know, on a book you like. It can and often is, honestly, as beautiful and as well written as most novels. And it can also be a complex, beautifully written expansion of a good novel. So when we talk about fanfiction, we talk about the ways that it adapts, expands, and creates from quote-unquote original material. We will get into that. And therefore, as general characteristics, fanfictions are therefore based on intellectual property by someone else. They are non-commercial, embedded in fan culture and inseparable from fandom, and they do serve like a very specific and integral function for fan communities. I cannot plug and recommend Zara Z, depending on where you are, video, an exhaustive defense of fanfiction. It is incredible. We will be touching on a lot of the terms and arguments she discusses in the video, but she does a much better job at explaining and at defending fanfiction within the context of art and giving a more historical kind of perspective on it. So I cannot plug that enough.
Fanfiction is really entering the mainstream now, and I mean this as in like the sense of it used to be a very, very marginalized, like, what's the word, like niche, nerdy and frowned upon thing, but it's very much in the daylight now, let's say. 2025 is being referred to as the year of Dramini, just from the sheer amount of Dramini fanfiction that's being published as just traditionally published books.
Who's saying that?
TikTok, girl.
Okay, I was like, who? Okay,
TikTok.
Amazing. I love that. Thank you, TikTok.
I mean, like, I can name 3 off the top of my head that are, like, very, very big Dramini fanfictions that are being published. So if you know, like, Manacle, that's being published as Alchemized next year. If you know Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love, that's being published as The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy by Bridget Knightley. And yeah, so it's just, like, there's just a lot of big fanfictions that are being published as traditional books next year. And I think the mainstream nature of fanfiction now can also be very much seen in the fact that the internet's resident librarian, Jack Edwards himself, made a TikTok recently about how various classical works in the English literary canon are essentially fanfiction. So he points out Wide Sargasso Sea and Paradise Lost as examples of this. And yeah, because of all of this, I think there's much more of a formal conversation about the validity of fanfiction as genuine creations and how essential the act of creating fanfiction is to how human culture has developed throughout history, which is exactly what we want to discuss today.
Yes. And also, just to plug ourselves in, not only has Jack Edwards made a video, a TikTok on fanfiction, we have too. And we went slightly viral, so go follow us at giftedcs.pod on TikTok. You know, it can be 11 seconds or it can be an hour. Please enjoy our content. So yes, moving on.
We cater to a wide audience,
Exactly.
guys. I think this episode wouldn't be complete without us sharing our own personal experiences with writing fanfiction, as all of these rants that we're creating for you on the internet are personal passion interests. So I went back in the day when I was a young lass of 12 or 13 probably. I used to write Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and Percy Jackson fanfiction on fanfiction.net. You will not find my username anymore because I have deleted that account. And I kind of wish I didn't. I kind of wish I just privated everything because it would be interesting to look back. Like, for instance, my like old bookmarks are no longer there. I'm sure I still have like the original like Word docs of my fanfiction saved on my hard drive somewhere, but like it's lost. No idea where to find it anymore. I remember the fanfiction that I got the most traction / engagement on fanfiction.net was a Hunger Games AU where Peeta, like, so it's set during Mockingjay, and Peeta dies while in captivity in the capital. So like, you know, there's that scene when like Gale goes on like a rescue mission to get Peeta and he comes back hijacked. So in my version, he dies and Gale comes back like, you know, without Peeta, and it's like the main ship is Katniss and Gale.
I can't believe you were Team Gale. That's wild.
I was like 12, 13. Like, you cannot blame me. Also, it was like, you know, edgy to like not ship the canon. You know what I mean? So that was that. And I kid you not, it was probably called like Guilty Joy or something like that. Because it very much explored how Katniss like was like super happy to get together with Gale, but also super sad that Peeta was dead. I was so young and I had no idea how romance or emotions work. But a lot of people liked the plot of it. So I got a lot of people being like, oh my God, next chapter, please, which was so important for me as a little, you know, 13-year-old, 14-year-old like writer. And and just to continue that, like fanfiction did give me a lot in terms of like experience in writing. I remember writing a lot of like short drabbles, remember that word, drabbles and one shots purely as like writing exercise, which they were just, again, on my laptop, like this was just for me. But it like really like just gave me the practice to develop my prose. And I think it's really sad because like the reason I stopped writing fanfiction and publishing it by proxy was because I was like, oh, I need to be like a serious writer. I need to like work on my own original stuff or I would never be like a real writer. But guess what? Like original writing is like original stories are really, really hard to write, especially when you're young and all of these things, like, and you're busy with your life and school. And so what happened is I just stopped writing altogether. And like, you know, fanfiction gave me that sense of an audience, of like a community that was responding to my work, and that was so motivating. And when you're writing by yourself, writing original stuff, like that's just not a thing. And little 15-year-old me did not have the discipline to continue. So yeah, that's me and fanfiction.
Yeah, fanfiction really gives you an audience and a responsibility to it. I also wrote fanfiction. Again, this is very personal to us. I wrote Twilight fanfiction. Because that was what was happening in my brain and in culture. And I wrote Edward Bella when I was like 13 and didn't know I was gay because that was the thing. And then when I was like 15 and realized I was gay, I started writing Bella Rosalie, which honestly, so good. That was the base. I don't think I've ever said this ever. This is like, I've never said this. The Bella Rosalie fanfiction is the base for the short film I ended up doing when I was 17.
Really?
The basis. Yeah, it was also called The Princess. It's actually,
I did not know that.
Yeah, it actually, I don't like, but it was so like, it was just the dynamics that I ended up kind of like exploring, and I never finished the Bella Rosalie one, but it was like that dynamic that led me to write the short story and then the short film that I made when I was like 17 in high school. So yeah, honestly, the beginnings of things.
Oh my God. Wow.
And yeah, so but my kind of longest and fanfiction probably had like 20 plus chapters that I got like, I don't think I got engagement. Because I was publishing it in Spanish in potterfix.com. .net or whatever the fuck, and it was called No Happy Ending because of a Mika song. We need to like unpack so much of my youth. But it was Harry Potter Twilight crossover where Bella is Harry Potter's sister. Because I was just really into I love tropes and crossovers, but I was also just really into like making Bella like an active character, and kind of having like the romance tension of Twilight with like the adventure side of Harry Potter, and I love that shit. So yeah, it got me writing. I received some instant feedback. I remember like dedicating chapters to my friends. It was just like satisfying to be like, I have writing under my name. And then I stopped writing that because eventually I just didn't know where to take it and I got lazy, but it was lovely and I stand by it, and it's gone. Don't look for it. So yes, that's it.
I do love us like bearing our souls, being like, oh yeah, fanfiction was so integral to like my development as a writer, but don't, like, it's not there anymore. You won't find it over my dead body.
Exactly. Never ever again.
So as always, a couple of disclaimers before we progress with our argument. We will, as we have said in every single episode where we've mentioned fanfiction or shipping, not be talking about real people or celebrity-based fanfiction, simply just because we have no real experience with it, and it's not really what we've constructed our thinking and arguments around. The other disclaimer is we shall be referring to the author known as J.K. Rowling as Shakira. Because we will be discussing the Harry Potter fandom more deeply than we have in our previous episode, especially in later this episode, because like fanfiction, ownership, and like this fandom are particularly important to our argument. And like we are fans clearly, but we want to make very, very clear we do not support J.K. Rowling, and we wholeheartedly condemn her persecution of trans people and transphobic remarks, which is why, to discredit her, we have decided to refer to her throughout this entire episode as Shakira. This is based on a Try Guys video from 4 years ago, in which it's called Try Guys Find Their Harry Potter Patronuses, and there is a singular picture of Shakira with the Harry Potter cast at a premiere. It's a bit of a inside joke between the two of us. Like whenever we like personally talk about J.K. Rowling and Shakira, we refer to her as Shakira. So we are extending this part of our friendship to you.
Yes.
So yeah, if you skip the intro and are just skimming through the episode, you will be very confused to hear about us talking about Shakira. And don't say we didn't warn you.
So yeah, moving on from Shakira. Great video, guys. Thank you. I think it was Eugene who just was like, and the real author of Harry Potter, Shakira, and posted that picture on the screen. So that's a vibe. So moving on from Shakira, we want to get going the episode with what we're going to talk about. We will be interrogating what makes fanfiction, highlighting the ways in which it shares principles and practices present in both literary classics and contemporary bestsellers. In our last episode, we talked about the value of, repetitive, playful, joyful, trope-led qualities of fanfiction. However, in this episode, we want to focus on kind of the opposite side of how fanfiction is also innovative. It's considered adaptation. It challenges and transforms the works it is based on until it could be argued it becomes a new work in itself. So we want to show the ways in which fanfiction is literary and literature is fanfiction. We will also take on some of the questions many people ask when they talk about fanfiction, either defend it or mock it. These kind of questions of like, well, is Shakespeare fanfiction? Is Dante's Inferno fanfiction? Isn't every myth-telling fanfiction? So we'll be discussing that. And just overall, just so you know what to expect, this episode is our love letter to fanfiction, specifically to writing it, to it being an art form and writing worth engaging with as both like a writer and a reader. So that said, this will be kind of like an extended intro, but I think this is very important to our argument. So to talk more about fanfiction, as a reminder, fanfiction as a term and as we know it now is as old as the internet, or as the internet has been available to the masses. So around the 60s and 70s, the way we discuss fanfiction started with the Star Trek fandom, but before that we could argue that zines and unofficial sequels were fanfiction, and I think we could argue they were like Jane Austen book clubs or Arthur Conan Doyle book clubs, like Sherlock Holmes fan clubs who like were tired of waiting or dissatisfied with the ending, or in the case of Jane Austen, where like, what happens after Pride and Prejudice? Like, they were literally just writing these unofficial sequels or alternative writing or alternative stories to these like very famous books and sharing it with each other. So that's definitely fan fiction. And there were also like fanzines, especially again in the 70s, with like a lot of fandoms on TV where people were writing their own stories, like their own alternative versions, especially when it comes to queer ships, and sending it to each other across the US. Like all of like that is fan fiction. And like we just want to say that it wasn't invented with AO3. The practice of loving a book so damn much you want to keep writing it and engaging with it is like as old as storytelling, and some people were doing it to like massive books like Jane Austen and Sherlock Holmes. And that practice in a way touches on one of the core qualities of fanfiction, which is transformativity. Transformativity is a term I came across in, again, Zarazet's video, and to kind of define it and how it functions within fanfiction, a work is transformative or is deemed to be of transformative use when it uses a copyrighted work but in a different way or for a different purpose than the original. So it gives it a new expression, meaning, and purpose. It literally transforms something that already existed. So this is a term defenders and writers of fanfiction use a lot to kind of justify the ways that fanfiction is not copyright infringement because it does something different. It's not just stealing, but also the way it kind of likens fanfiction to other practices that, again, use and transform original works. So works that are of transformative use could include parody, databases, recreations, pop art. Zarazet has a whole thing about pop art and Dadaism, like to what extent is it stealing if you're using the same thing but transforming its meaning. That is what fanfiction does. It is transformative. And then there is an incredible essay. I wish I could quote the whole thing. Anna Wilson's essay, Fanfiction and Pre-Modern Literature Methods and Definitions. And I'm gonna quote a massive part of the of the essay because I'm in love with it. Just go read it. But she talks about transformativity. She quotes from the Organization of Transformative Works. So Anna Wilson writes, in the name the Organization of Transformative Works, the term transformative asserts that fan fiction occupies a legal category of artistic works, including, for example, parody or reviews that quote the original work, that have sufficiently transformed another property as to not be in violation of copyright. However, fans and fan scholars often used the term transformative in place of counter terms like appropriative or derivative, where the operative discourse is not legal or even moral but aesthetic. Here, the term transformative serves to argue that originality is not the be-all and end-all of artistic practice, as well as that fanfiction as art, legal considerations aside, does not necessarily occupy a place below its source in a cultural or artistic hierarchy. These analyses focus on the formal and narrative elements of fanfiction, the ways in which it transforms its source, and to what effect. End quote. What I love about this quote and this section of Wilson's essay is that it gets into two important arguments used to either delegitimize or defend fanfiction, which is copyright laws and originality. Because, again, transformative is a way that people can legally argue that they're not stealing and that their work is of value, even if it's based on something else. And even if it's based on something else, who cares? I think that's what the quote really gets into.
Yeah, it's like interesting when you think about copyright because like when we think of like sequels, reboots, and like stuff like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, how is that all fanfiction? Like Twisters, the reboot / sequel. If you take like the Ghostbusters reboot with like all women, it's like the same universe, but it is like a different thing with different writers and different actors, and it's a different story fundamentally, but it's recognizably Ghostbusters. Like, you know, obviously the IP, but like it's just the aesthetics of it.
Yes, no, I think that's the thing where like Twisters and Ghostbusters are the same vibe of like they use the same aesthetic. They use a very similar. It almost feels like the progeny of the original film, but it's just a completely different story. A lot of the times written by completely different people because these people in the 80s are not being the screenwriters in the 2020s.
And also another really interesting case study would be What If, the animated series by the MCU, which is, if you don't know, like it's literally short episodes that ask what if Peggy Carter was the first Avenger. It's taking key plot points from the MCU and twisting it, and they create little like scenarios. That's just AU fanfiction.
Yeah, that's just AUs.
And like the most like obvious difference is that these are like big budget productions with a lot of lawyers and copyright licenses behind them, as opposed to like the free self-published stuff that you find on like AO3. So like the core like difference, I guess, for people who are against fanfiction but are fine with this sort of stuff is that the big studios like own the copyrighted content. So like even though it is like a different artistic vision, even though it's a different creator, they are still like kind of under that umbrella of like being legally owned by the same company and have that protection of Big Daddy Disney or Universal that protects them from any like criticism of copyright infringement or like plagiarism.
Yeah, and
it's all capitalism.
Exactly. And I think that that's the thing where like people who love the MCU but hate fanfiction or think, you know, they're not the same thing. It's a copyright and a legal matter that somehow seeps into it. Like it legitimizes it within the capitalist copyright perspective. Like it is not fanfiction legally, but somehow that becomes an artistic thing. Somehow the fact that not even the same person, but somehow Stan Lee's estate has like its signature in the 30th page of the contract, that somehow becomes like, oh, it's technically still Stan Lee's. Like it technically is artistically still his. It isn't. It really isn't. It's like it's a massive group, but somehow I think that copyright gets into this weird in between where we as a society, sorry, we live in a society, but we as a society equate legality with quality. And
yes,
copyright legal protections of something like the MCU or Ghostbusters somehow also becomes like invisibly also an artistic protection of like, well, it's kind of by the same person. And I think that is a very recent phenomenon, because before we didn't have copyright laws like 150 years ago. People just wrote whatever the hell. And I think it's interesting that like it's considered fan fiction or it becomes a legal battle when it infringes on modern copyright laws, but if it's on the public domain, it's an homage. You know? Not to say that there's like Shakespeare fanfiction on AO3, but if that were to be published expertly, that would not be considered fanfiction, because there is no Shakespeare estate to claim legality over it.
Yeah. I think an interesting contemporary example to look at here is Rainbow Rowell's Fangirl. So Fangirl is a 2013 novel traditionally published that is basically Rainbow Rowell's own love letter to fanfiction. It's about a like shy freshman in college who writes a very, very popular fanfiction that, and like it's a rom-com, so like, you know, it's intersperses chapters of the rom-com itself with chapters of this fictional fanfiction. And I think that's all fine, right? The fanfiction that the main character in Fangirl writes is quite obviously dreary fanfiction or Harry Potter fanfiction by Shakespeare, of course. I don't want to go into too much of the plot, but it's very, very recognizably Hogwarts, Draco, Harry. And that's fine. They create their own like magic system or whatever for this fictional fanfiction. But what I found really interesting is that those excerpts of fanfiction within that novel took on a life of their own because people were so invested in the fanfiction itself. So in 2015, Rainbow Rowell published Carry On, which is the published version of that very fanfiction. Like it is taking the characters from the fanfiction in Fangirl and creating an original novel out of it. But as I say, it's very recognizably Harry Potter inspired. So I don't know where the legal battle happened here, because it must have been at least mentioned, because it's so recognizably Hogwarts, and no one's ever really talked about it. But it's an interesting way of like, yeah, I guess Rainbow Rowell was just able to bypass everything that we've been talking about, because as far as I know, no copyright claims have been raised by Shakira.
Yeah.
And indeed, like Rainbow Rowell published a sequel to Carry On in 2019 called Wayward Son.
Somehow it feels like Carry On is within the legal and artistic umbrella of Fangirl. So that's fine. But Carry On within Fangirl would be considered within the umbrella of Harry Potter. So yeah.
Yeah.
Good night. Okay.
Yeah.
And then when we talk about this, right, of like, all of these things, like the moment it dilutes into someone else's work and then that work becomes someone else's work, this is when we get into kind of more of a framework of what does that even mean.
Yeah, like the framework of what is a thing in itself. How does something maintain its identity when it's put through transformative works?
Exactly. Because when we transformative, like in its definition, is like it transforms an original work, but then what is original, and is originality even something we have to consider as part of like the artistic value of something? And all of those questions came perfectly within this framework we're gonna use. Generally, we had not thought about this is so relevant, and we had not thought about it at all until someone commented on our viral TikTok that fanfiction becomes I think they phrased it as like a ship of Theseus scenario, and I was like, oh my god, it literally is. So thank you, shout out to Mayer-Schonberger, I hope that's how we pronounce it, or Mayer-Schonberger, I don't know how to pronounce your username, but like shout out to you. You literally have given us the like one of the most important frameworks for this episode. You're very smart. Thank you.
Yeah. It's such an interesting lens to think about fanfiction through. And for those of you who don't know, the Ship of Theseus is an ancient thought experiment / paradox, which was first mentioned by Plutarch in his Parallel Lives, specifically the life of Theseus. And he essentially poses the question of whether an object is still the same object if you replaced each of its individual original components over time, one by one. So in Plutarch's original text, Theseus's ship's planks had all been replaced one by one with sturdier counterparts. And so the dilemma philosophers were having over this scenario was whether or not it was the same boat that had returned. And then in the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, in an essay about identity, expanded this paradox to pose a scenario where someone kept all the original planks of the ship as they were being replaced and then used those original planks to make a new boat. So the question is the new boat the original ship of Theseus? Are there now two ships? The latter thing that I just mentioned, he refers to as absurd.
Yes. It's a very important and interesting thought experiment, and we bring it up. This is often used when it comes to identity, because we as people, you know, over time change little by little. Our bodies are constantly changing. It kind of poses this question of like, are we the same person we were 5, 10, 20 years ago, despite of our gradual changes? Are we just a completely different person, even though we have like recognizably the same body? So that's kind of the questions that the ship of the way that the ship of Theseus is applied to identity.
You know, like the whole like thing that we actually gradually replace ourselves one by one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In the same way we use this framework, we can interrogate the identity not of a person, but of a text, the identity of a text. What is the original ship of Theseus when it comes to fan fiction? Is the new boat stealing? Is the new boat stealing? Like truly though, like
is the new boat copyright infringement?
Exactly. Or is the original boat with all of the old parts good if it's deteriorating and dying on sea? Anyway. In this case, like with the identity of a text, of a TV show, a movie, or a book, like, is a supernatural Vietnam War AU really the intellectual property of Warner Bros. And the CW? Like, is a canon compliant sequel an infringement on authorship, or is it an expansion on that authorship, an expansion of something that no longer belongs to the author but to the cultural imagination, like Wicked, like
yes.
White Sargasso Sea, like All the Young Dudes? With the Ship of Theseus, we want to just like poke at these questions that people usually use to call fanfiction lazy or stealing, for being unoriginal or invalid.
Of course, the best genre of fanfiction to bring in as an example of what we've just been discussing are AU specifically, but we already did a whole ass episode about that, so please just check out our previous episode.
Yes, thank you. This is just a plug for ourselves. Like,
yes, exactly. We talk about how AUs work, where they like what the origins of them, and how they relate to Sylvia Plath's fig tree analogy. We did English literature in our undergrad.
Correct.
And please also do see our viral TikTok, where we point out how many published works out in the wild for you to enjoy at your local Barnes & Nobles or Waterstones right now are indeed published AU fanfictions. Specifically, in our previous episode, we point out that you'll always recognize some elements or recognize the canon work within the AU fanfiction, AU like published whatever, if you love the canon work. But in many cases, it is still a very original adaptation. It takes on a life of itself. It has its own quirks and its own lore, even if it's recognizable.
And the same can be said, I think, for like adaptation and retellings. Just because you can recognize, sorry, Wicked is just in my brain, but like just because you can recognize like haha hee hee the yellow brick road doesn't mean that you can't like enjoy Wicked, not as a retelling of the Wizard of Oz, not as a fan fiction, you know, but as its own thing that expands on it. And I think the same can be said for like all retellings of any kind that I think are the most like recognizable literature that are the most fan fiction-y, like all retellings and adaptations. Most notably, the Bible is like probably the thing that we draw the most from. And it's not only like, oh, there was an apple, there was like the symbol of apple or the symbol of sin. It's like their incredible literature is just the same story but to the left. Yeah. Like Paradise Lost, which honestly isn't not that like a POV POV Satan expansion of the universe. Is Dante's Divine Comedy not like a canon compliant fan art of of like the afterlife? And isn't Narnia a shapeshifter fantasy AU of the New Testament where Jesus is a lion? Anyway,
can I also, just because Wicked's also on my mind, I just want people to know, whoever's listening, and you, Mijin, if you didn't know this already, how different Wicked the musical is compared to the book it was based on.
Yes!
Because obviously Wicked the musical is a fucking musical, and it has all the
it's for
hallmarks
Broadway,
of
it's for
a
people
musical.
Yeah, it's for like wealthy,
yeah, it's family friendly fun.
Yes, wealthy cosmopolitans.
Wicked by Gregory Maguire is not a happy book. It's not for children, so please, to all the excited moms out there, please don't buy it for your 12-year-old Ariana Grande fan. But it's all recognizably The Wizard of Oz. But anyway, I digress. The other thing that we wanted to point out about retellings is, well, very obviously as well, alongside Christian Bible retellings, our myth retellings, specifically Greek myth retellings, I think are probably the most common in popular culture and the Western canon, obviously. And here I'm thinking of stuff like The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller and Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, the Disney like Hercules movie.
Oh my God.
These are very straightforward like retellings of popular myths. But then also let's stop and consider translations as a form of retelling. And I'm particularly thinking of Emily Wilson's 2018 English translation of the Odyssey. It was the first by a woman, and as Charlotte Higgins at The Guardian put it in her review of Emily Wilson's translation, it's armed with a sharp scholarly rigor, and she has produced a translation that exposes centuries of masculinist readings of the poem, end quote. So Emily Wilson's work, while obviously plot-wise is the same as the Odyssey, and like, you know, line by line it will be a translation in that sense, it does produce something new, and it produces something that readers find more meaning in that previous translations didn't provide. And indeed, the original work didn't provide in itself either.
This is a whole other side of, like, that's like a whole argument we're not ready to discuss as whether translators are authors, you know? But Emily Wilson's, like, the example of Emily Wilson's translation is a great one. I will also want to point out, this is just to build our argument, basically, of I also read an essay that I love that kind of points out another form of transformative work is academia. Academia literally takes word by word, like it utilizes chunks of text, it utilizes plot points, literally someone else's words, and then a new take on them. It in a way, academia is the non-fiction equivalent of fan fiction.
Yes.
Like fan fiction is fiction. It retells, recontextualizes, expands, and adapts through story, and academia retells, recontextualizes, and adapts through critical rigor, like through criticism.
Yeah, 100%. Like, all academic thinking is just like different perspectives folding on top of each other.
Yeah.
Until you reach a new perspective.
And you wouldn't say academics are stealing in the same way that you wouldn't say Emily Wilson is stealing.
Exactly. Building upon arguments isn't stealing. It's building upon an argument to create your own argument. God knows every undergrad out there has been like, yes, let me, a 19-year-old high school graduate, come up with something completely original on Shakespeare.
Yes. True story.
So bringing this back to fanfiction, the fanfiction equivalent of retellings are, of course, retellings. And the case study I want to bring in here is A Court of Mist and Fury, brackets, recent POV by Illyrian Tremors on AO3. So this is a very, very, very popular rewriting of certain chapters of the second book in the ACOTAR series, Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, if you don't know, from the main male love interest perspective, Resent's perspective. It's the same thing as, for instance, Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer, which is, of course, Twilight, but from Edward's perspective, and Grey by E.L. James, which is 50 Shades of Grey, but from, oh my god, Christian Grey's perspective. And Illyrian Tremors has also written certain chapters from the other two ACOTAR books from Resent's perspective as well. It's just A Court of Mist and Fury is probably the most popular chunk of his perspective, if that makes sense. It's like, for those of you who don't know, in the second book, there's just a lot of secrets that come to light, and people are like clamoring for Resent's perspective on the pining, basically, because that's where all the pining happens. It's all the forced proximity. It's all the like he knows he falls first and harder, etc. So people just really, really wanted that POV. And Illyrian Tremors very graciously granted it. And the consensus among the fandom, again, this is such a popular fanfiction, is that Illyrian Tremors writes exactly like the original author Sarah J. Maas. And honestly, like, having read both works, like the original Sarah J. Maas and Illyrian Tremors rewriting, I have to agree. They're really, like, Illyrian Tremors hits the nail on the head, and it's also, like, exactly how I would imagine Resent's voice in my head as well. It like the fanfiction, it does combine dialogue from the original book, but everything else is like original to the fanfiction, of course, and it's also completely canon compliant, so it is truly, truly a rewrite. But the fandom doesn't treat it like copyright infringement or anything like that. In fact, they, like, you know how a lot of fanfictions, popular fanfictions, are being bound by, you know, amateur bookbinders, and so people are binding, you know, Akamaf Resent's POV and putting it right on their bookshelf alongside the original ACOTAR series. And the fandom really, really treats it as a continuation of the world that Sarah J. Maas built, and not as a replacement, as an expansion serving a very, very different function in their love for Sarah J. Maas's original work and characters. And it's much like, you know, John Milton writing Paradise Lost or Madeline Miller writing The Song of Achilles. I think Illyrian Tremors really took this thing that they loved and showed their devotion to it by expanding their own understanding of the canon work to kind of share that perspective with readers. In other words, interpreting and translating.
I love that. I love the visual of putting the New Bound book in the shelf. It's like, it is not a hierarchy. Fanfiction is not lesser. Like, an expansion and an interpretation is at like on par with the original work. Another small thing, Sarah Zed's video kind of touches upon this, and I will touch upon it as well. When you said, like, Illyrian Tremors writes exactly like Sarah J. Maas, and how that is, like, to the benefit of the fanfiction, to kind of, like, kind of fit in the canon. Sarah Zed talks about how writing for television, it's the same skill. It's, like, a very worthwhile skill. Like, if I, please, were to get hired to write for a long, you know, a series, like, for Grey's Anatomy, for example, you're not expected to bring in your new syntax and fun little voice to the writer's table. You're expected to have the writing skill to simulate the voice of someone else. That is skill. And yes, Grey's Anatomy is under Shondaland, but if I were to take my writer's table episode and publish it for free on AO3, that's suddenly fan fiction. But other people are paid hundreds of thousands to, maybe not, they're paid pennies. They're paid pennies to be in these writers' rooms and to have the experience and skill to be able to adapt their writing to someone else's writing. And that is still their work.
Yes, there's a difference between created by and written by.
Exactly. Oh my god, that's it. End of episode. Bitch, That's it. We did it. Created by Bible, written by Milton. Like, fucking hell. Like, sorry. Okay. And so now that we're talking about like all of these works, whether it's fan fiction or Paradise Lost, that expand and translate and interpret universes, we want to kind of dig in more into very famous examples of works that do that, but not only like, you know, translate and expand, but what that they are successful because they take other people's stories and update them to their current society, their current audience. AKA, we want to discuss two dead white guys who defined our undergrad degree in English, who we love, unironically.
We've grown to love.
Yes.
God knows studying them was a different story in itself.
I don't recommend anyone whose first language isn't English to think they can do this very, like, to think they were not gonna struggle with these two authors, because to this day, I don't know, I am a pentameter who. Anyway, so the two authors we'll discuss are, you know, two greatest authors of the English language according to the degree we paid for, Chaucer and Shakespeare.
So doing this in chronological order,
yes.
And also the order in which we study them. Shout out to everyone at UCL.
Yeah.
So beginning with Geoffrey Chaucer, our boy. So Chaucer was a 14th century poet, and he's also known as the father of English literature. And he's best known for the Canterbury Tales, which is a collection of 24 stories in 17,000 lines of poetry in Middle English. People always refer to anything that isn't contemporary English as Old English. Guys, it's very different. Let me be pedantic about this for 1 second. Shakespeare did not write in Old English. Old English is in another language itself. It was spoken until about 1066, and then onwards it was Middle English. Different languages. Anyway, Chaucer wrote in Middle English. So the Canterbury Tales, which is his most popular work. So the popularization of the English vernacular is attributed to the Canterbury Tales. While the Canterbury Tales is an original work in sort of ostensibly, its stories are all drawn from a huge array of sources, from Boccaccio's Decameron, Boethius's Consolation Philosophy, Dante's Divine Comedy, and many other medieval and pre-medieval works. All of these works kind of combine to inspire both the form of the Canterbury Tales and the stories individually told within. Chaucer was also the author of several other lengthy works of poetry, such as the Romaunt of the Rose, which is a translation of the French poem Le Roman de la Rose. Yes.
We can't confirm or deny that was a pronunciation, but you get it.
It's okay. My degree's in English, not French. Mm-hmm. He also wrote The Legend of Good Women, which is also a poem in the form of a dream vision, which tells the tale of 10 virtuous women, which include Cleopatra, Medea, Ariadne, Dido, and Thisbe. And once again, these are all drawn from works such as Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses and his Heroides, and more.
You're saying it's a crossover of like Virgil, Ovid.
It's not a crossover because all of them are kind of confined to their own little stories. Oh. But I know what you mean.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's a collection of different interlocking stories in theme, not in universe and plot, let's say. So these are all like virtuous women, and they've all been scorned by men, and apparently Chaucer was a feminist. Who knew? And then the work that I want to discuss more in depth, which is probably Chaucer's second most famous work beyond the Canterbury Tales, which is the epic poem Troilus and Cressade, which tells the story of the tragic lovers Troilus and Cressade, and is set during the siege of Troy. So Troilus is actually first mentioned in Homer's Iliad, but the version of Troilus that can be found in Chaucer's work specifically is very much a medieval creation, which was, created within the medieval period and adapted from whatever original source it came from to better fit the part of the courtly lover, as that was more popular in storytelling back then. Cressade is kind of a similar deal, but she's not based on any Greek source. She is a medieval literary figure that just started appearing around the Middle Ages in retellings of the Trojan War. That is to say, neither Troilus or Cressade are Chaucer's original creation. They're very much just of his time. And indeed, the tale that he tells in Troilus and Cresside is not original to Chaucer either. So while Chaucer's primary source was almost certainly Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, the first version of the Troilus and Cresside tale is from Benoit de Saint-Mars? Girl. Why is there so much French? I hate Middle English.
I wonder where Middle English came from. I wonder what country influenced the UK.
So,
a tale by Benoit.
Benoit de Saint-Marie.
Mm-hmm.
Roman de Troyes. Mm-hmm. Roman de Troyes. Which is a French poem written in the 12th century. So, as such, neither of Chaucer's greatest works are completely original creations, and also, like, his other works have also largely been translations as well. Like, he very famously translated Boethius's Constellation Philosophy into Boece, which is the Middle English translation of that. He does add some other shit to it, like, but it is ostensibly a translation of an original
wasn't there, like,
work.
a controversy where, like, the Romance of the Rose was meant to be, like, an adaptation, and then, like, 3 centuries later, they were like, oh no, it's word by word translation. Like, we found the original French, and so much of the Romance of the Rose, Chaucer's version, is just word by word translation from French.
Yeah.
Hilarious.
100%. So, indeed, Chaucer has been referred to as the Grand Translator or the Great Translator. And this phrase is attributed to Eustace Deschamps' poem Ballade addressed to Chaucer. His best known works are translations, or at least adaptations of popular and well-known medieval literature, but of his time, the literature of his time. But that is also why he was so influential in creating the tradition of English literature, especially as we know it, because by translating and adapting these, works that are from the greater Western literary tradition, he was testing the limits of his own vernacular, and he was also seeing how he could communicate his culture, the culture of his time and place via these literary traditions. Another thing to point out is that literary figures such as Troilus and Cresside, as in, like, when I say literary figures, just like people that crop up again, characters, in fact, that crop up time and again in literature of certain specific eras, was just so much more common in the medieval and Renaissance eras. You'll find the same people popping up in basically every work. Like, God knows there's a million versions of Troilus and Cresside, and there's a million versions of, Robin Hood, or whatever. You know what I mean? It's very much like, oh, this is just the stories that we tell about these specific people.
Like Fanon. Or like a cinematic universe.
Yeah, 100%. Like, it's certainly true now too, but we just talk about them as tropes.
Yes. Or as, we paid like $1 million to be able to use this name in our, Yeah. And so we travel almost 2 centuries to the other father, the other gay dad of English literature, Shakespeare. William Shakespeare. That's how I learned how to spell that. And a lot of his work was original. A lot of his work has, again, because of the literature of the time, we could not call it fan fiction. We could just say that some elements were, inspired by something else, but Shakespeare took incredible liberties. But the one that we can really, really dig into as fan fiction is Romeo and Juliet, which is arguably his most, I would say his most popular out of, like, most people think of Romeo and Juliet when they think of Shakespeare. So we all know it. It is famous and everlasting, and it's interesting that, like, Romeo and Juliet's Shakespeare's version has spurred its own, like, iterations, rewritings, adaptations, films with Leonardo DiCaprio. But it in and of itself is a retelling and an iteration. So Romeo and Juliet is a tragic romance about a young couple whose love is torn apart by the political rivalries of their families. And it premiered on the stage in 1597. However, the story is not original to Shakespeare. As in fact, very little was original back then, and I think we could talk about Hamlet in, like, a similar way. But Romeo and Juliet can be the story can be traced to so many other people. As Felicia was saying, it also can be traced to a tradition. Like, Romeo and Juliet is a tragic romance, and it follows the same structure as ancient romances that come from Ovid, such as Pyramus and Thisbe. So in the way that, like, again, trope is genre, kind of the same thing. There was a certain expectation for tragic romances coming all the way to, like, the genuine Roman Empire, and that is the way that Shakespeare constructed Romeo and Juliet. But even before Romeo and Juliet, the same, like before 1597, which is when it premiered, Romeo and Juliet, like the characters themselves, and even like the names Capulet and Montague, that is mentioned in Dante's Inferno. And Romeo and Juliet as characters, with like basically the same plot or very similar, came from like decades of Italian romances that were previously written within the same century, so within like the 1500s. Shakespeare most likely heard of this story through Arthur Brooke's translation of Matteo Bandello's work, which is genuinely basically the same story. So to quote Wikipedia, Shakespeare borrowed heavily from both, so from both Arthur Brooke's translation and Matteo Bandello's original, but expanded the plot by developing a number of supporting characters, in particular Mercutio and Paris, end quote. So, again, heavy on the word expanded, Romeo and Juliet is transformative work. And it has the same plot as someone else, and it has nothing original when it comes to like the story or the characters. It is all about how it utilizes those stories and characters. We could say the same thing about Marauders fanfiction, and we will. So Romeo and Juliet is attributed to Shakespeare right now. Like if we say who wrote Romeo and Juliet, we will say William Shakespeare. And that is not because he came out with the subject matter of the story, but because of his adaptation. But because he took his skill and used it to kind of rewrite this story that someone else had created originally. And his skill was not only iambic pentameter, but his ability to connect to audiences of his time and tell stories successfully that also transcend his time. That is why Romeo and Juliet is technically Shakespeare's work.
Mm-hmm. To take it one step further, every performance of Romeo and Juliet is in itself an original work.
Correct. Oh yeah, and with Chaucer, I also was like, Hello, the Wife of Willesden by Zadie Smith. Like, you're saying that she rewrote a story that was itself a rewriting of a story to adapt to her context in North London? Like, Anyway, all one soup of story that we just kind of add more to.
And to bring this back to fan fiction, we've mentioned Marauders. Let's dive into it. The Marauders of the Harry Potter universe by Shakira. If you're not on TikTok, the Marauders fandom has very, very much become a thing in itself and separate and individual to the Harry Potter fandom. And if you've been living under an even bigger rock, the Marauders refer to Harry Potter's dad, James Potter, his godfather, Sirius Black, his werewolf teacher, Remus Lupin, and Ron's pet rat, Peter Pettigrew. And the fandom itself is generally centered around their time at Hogwarts. And of course, this period of time / these characters were never fully written out in the original books by Shakira, only mentioned and alluded to, but as we know, that's never stopped a fandom from developing ships and headcanons about these characters before. And a central aspect of the Marauders fandom is the ship Wolfstar, which is Remus Lupin and Sirius Black, which lends the entire fandom a really, really queer audience and a really queer undertone. And there's other like minor ships that are also queer that can be included in this fandom too, just less popular. So I'm thinking of like Jagulas, for instance, which is James Potter, Harry Potter's dad, and Sirius Black's dead younger brother, Regulus.
Not dead. Sorry. He's dead by the time the story begins, but he's alive in every fanfiction you'll ever read. Yeah.
Exactly. This man was mentioned so briefly in the books. And yet he's like a central character to this fandom. But importantly, something that's really, really spurred the popularity of this fandom, the Marauders fandom, on TikTok particularly, I want to say, is the fanfiction All the Young Dudes by Miss King Bean 89. It has its own Wikipedia page. That's how significant it is. All the Young Dudes is a 500,000 plus word fanfiction, and it's mostly canon compliant, and it tells the story of the Marauders' time at Hogwarts with Remus Lupin as the central character, and it continues from Remus's first year at Hogwarts all the way until his death in the Battle of Hogwarts in, the 7th Harry Potter book. And I really, really cannot express to you how much of a life of its own this fanfiction has taken on. It has fanfic-specific fan casts. I mean, this is like kind of generic fan casting as well, but I want to say All the Young Dudes has a very specific set of fan casts, so notably Andrew Garfield and Ben Barnes as Remus and Sirius respectively, and something both actors has acknowledged publicly. That's how big this fanfiction and fandom is. There's fanfiction specific headcanons such as or like not even headcanons, just like things such as Mooney toast, which is this very, very specific way of cutting a piece of toast into 4 quarters and spreading a different like spread, like topping on them.
I have seen that in other fan fictions, and I did not know it came from here.
It's from All the Young Dudes. It's very specific.
God,
and so it feels like truly divorced from Shakira and her bigotry, because it's so queer. It's so full of queer joy and pain, but joy itself. And it's such a different celebration of these characters in this world. And because the Marauders are so briefly mentioned in the original canon works, it's so briefly tethered to the canon works themselves, and it's like such a original creation in itself. And I cannot stress to you, it's 500,000 plus words long. It's long, it's hefty, it's like there is an original character in it called Grant who has his own fandom now at this point. Like he is canon in a lot of people's heads because of how well fleshed out and how integral he is to telling the story of the Marauders in people's heads.
There's one article I read as well that was titled something like "The best Harry Potter novel was not written by J.K. Rowling," and it just refers to this. I also want to point out the soundbite of you saying Shakira and her bigotry. I love you, Shakira. Not like I love you, real Shakira.
Yes,
so
Shakira, Miss Shakira. Other than tax fraud, we love you. It was a little tax fraud. Sure. Can I also, like, just on the issue of our authorship, there is a very strong headcanon shared by many, maybe not by me, but by many, that Miss Kingbean 89 is, in fact, Ms. Taylor Allison Swift.
Oh my god.
This was particularly exacerbated by the release of the song The Black Dog. It's tenuous, but you'll see some TikToks out there and you'll be like, you know what? They make a compelling argument. It's not an impossibility that Miss Kingbean 89 is Taylor Swift. I mean, 1989.
Yeah, it's like a lot of iconic fan fictions. We do not know the author. Like the author as a real human person from a place, with a name has not come forward. It's just interesting. It's just death of the author to the max. The idea that it's both canon compliant but also expands the canon, and it found such popularity with queer audiences, I think speaks of what fan fiction can be. And that transformativity does not only apply to making things fun or making things, transformativity within fan fiction does not only apply to making things fun or smuttier, it also applies to making things safer. And also making them more complex.
Yes.
And on that, the Harry Potter fandom specifically, because it's huge. And I think AO3 Wrapped came out a few months ago, and it showed the second or the first biggest fandom with like millions of fan fictions was Wolfstar. Like, the fandom is huge, no matter how there hasn't been like a new Harry Potter book or anything. Like, the fandom is absolutely huge, and there's many more headcanons within it. Two of them that we would like to mention is one, Draco Malfoy, just like as a character. He is expanded incredibly within fan fiction, and there are many headcanons that are popular because of fan fiction. So fanfiction writers take what has been shown to be conflicted but ultimately kind of like corrupted and even depicted as like slightly cowardly character. I'm honestly same could be said for Snape. Like, I think they've done the same to Snape, where like yes, they're conflicted, yes, they're corrupted, but like it's still kind of seen as unfavorable in the canon, in like Shakira's canon, so we take that character who in the case of Draco was basically forced to join the equivalent of the Nazi party when he was like 17, and somehow it's still kind of like a character we don't really expand on. So we take him and we give him like extreme interiority, complexity. We expand on his family dynamics, on his relationship to power itself, to power, to wealth, to all of these important themes that Shakira touches on but never really develops when it comes to the Malfoys, and also expands and explores on his potential queerness and on his sexuality, just to create truly a brand new character, to a brand new iteration. Like, it is based on a lot of these hints, but it makes a brand new, very complex character.
I think from my personal experience with fanfiction, there are like two versions of Draco. There's queer Drarry Draco, and then there's not queer Dramini Draco. And in both, he's still like, conflicted, he's angsty, he's tortured, he's making hard decisions. But obviously Drarry Draco tends to be softer, whereas Dramini Draco tends to be more of like a dominating alpha type. But it's interesting, it's still the same character that that has so much interiority and complexity, as you say, but very different universes that they exist in.
Yeah, I was also gonna say about that, Shakira in an interview about Draco, the character Draco, I think she said something that like the reason why people love Draco is because of Tom Felton's portrayal. And yes, he's hot. Yes, as a performer, he has like a playfulness that cannot be denied that like he brought to the role of Draco. But I also think Shakira was just underestimating what an interesting character she brought to the fandom and just never really developed, because there's so much of Draco. We have like a very privileged but very, very conflicting and tortured character who went through a lot and who could really represent bigotry from another perspective, and it's fan fiction that has really explored that, not the original author. And another thing I just really, really wanted to mention, because it's not only on the translation and expanding of universes in fan fiction and in the Harry Potter fan fiction and in the Harry Potter fandom in specific, is not only when it comes to queerness, and yes, that is very, very, very common, because a lot of, as we discussed on our shipping episode, most shippers are queer and identify as women or non-binary. Yes, but also one of my favorite headcanons in fanfiction, and it's a lot in Marauders and Drary fanfiction, is that Harry himself is Indian. There are thousands of works that imagine Harry as mixed race, with James Potter being of Indian descent and Lily being white, and Harry is even given an Indian name in a lot of these fics, which is lovely. And that just brings like a beautiful and like sadder, more painful dimension to a lot of the content of the books, a lot of the subject matter, because then when James dies, before Harry can even remember him, it's not only the disconnect of like my, like, you know, I never knew my dad, is also like this complete disconnection from his culture, and the fact that he was forced to grow up with like really mean, abusive family, the Dursleys, who didn't love him, which again canonically would be Lily's white family. Then this abuse takes on a racialized element as well. So, and most importantly, I think what this speaks of is the lack of diversity, especially racial and ethnic, in Harry Potter. And the fact that we like wanted and needed, and Shakira's like Patil twins was never going to give us that. So by having Harry being Indian as a headcanon in so many works, it represents this hugely important community of Indians and in general like South Asian people in the UK, and gives us a more complex POC main character to a giant franchise. And it also just, in a human kind of thematic level, it adds to the themes of the original work. It resonates with the diverse audience of the series that saw themselves in Harry's isolation and alienation from his peers. And it is my favorite thing. There has been the headcanon and the kind of almost kind of, as we said in our last episode, collective imagination of this fandom clashes with the quote-unquote original work, because it has been so expanded and adapted, and it honestly feels so right to a lot of fans. And it reminded me of the Jorge Luis Borges quote, who was an Argentinian writer and translator and wrote a lot about translation. He has this very famous quote that goes, and I quote, "The original is not faithful to the translation," which is a very playful way of speaking about how translation becomes a new thing, becomes its own thing. And again, the original is not faithful to the translation. This feeling of like the translation and its new thing is valid, and sometimes it could hold up to the peak of the hierarchy. And I think that's what happens a lot in the Harry Potter fandom, where Shakira's work does not feel like enough, and it does not feel faithful to what we really think this story is in our brains.
Yeah.
And honestly, the same could be said for Shakespeare, you know, like if you read like the original Romeo and Juliet from the Italian author, I'm sure you would be like, that's not like Shakespeare, even though it came before.
Yeah.
Because they are all examples, whether or not they exist in, you know, in like medieval literature or in contemporary fandom culture. I think they are all part of the same literary tradition of adaptation and translation.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, it was just much more common to adapt in the Renaissance and Middle Ages. In fact, Martha Woodmansey, in the essay on the author effect, Recovering Collectivity, she writes, "From the Middle Ages right down through the Renaissance, new writing derived its value and authority from its affiliation with the text that preceded it, its derivation rather than its deviation from prior texts," end quote. So this is why the two fathers of English literature truly wrote zero original stories, like truly fully original stories, It's why it's so hard for anyone to write anything that's truly original, because it's all about like demanding authority. It's about connecting your writing to that which came before it in order to connect to other people, because we're all writing as part of a grand literary tradition. And as you say, like, no matter what form it takes, it's all part of it. It's all part of the circle of life, baby. Like, you know?
This isn't a bashing on copyright episode, but copyright is so key to discussing fan fiction, because I love the in this quote, what you just quoted points out that before, adapting and deriving from something greater or something famous, you kind of were like on the same, you were considered to have the kind of the same quality, because you're utilizing something, you know, like if you're utilizing the Bible to retell, like if you're doing a Bible retelling, you're kind of via proximity and via just the idea that you're able to read the Bible and think critically about it, you are sharing the same literary space as the Bible, and it gives you a lot of authority. Versus now, I think because of copyright and because of a lot of fandom spurs from like what we consider lowbrow, then it becomes somehow it's the opposite. If you're deriving from something, you're not at the par, you're not on par with it, you're below it, because you cannot have original thought. But before, for like most of English literature's history, the idea that you could read and interpret and think critically and engage with great works meant that you were yourself great.
So like, I guess the question we are skirting around here is, what is originality, and is there such a thing anymore?
Yes. And in general, like the idea that like fan fiction is erasing originality is absurd, as we have seen through all of the work ever. And I think we need to go back to the ship of Theseus, since it's the framework we're using for originality, and to Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher and writer who came up with this idea of like then of the second ship, like what would happen. So he kind of answers or expands on the ship of Theseus analogy by basically coming up with two solutions. If you think the ship with the new planks is the ship of Theseus, then it's because you think that identity comes from form. Like it literally has the same form, it has the same shape, you know? Therefore, that is the ship of Theseus. If you think that identity is about matter, as he calls it, then you think it's the second ship, because it's made of the planks, of the material of the first, you know, original ship. If we apply that to fan fiction, if you think that identity is about form, then everything based on something else is fan fiction, you know, because it kind of takes the same story. The Marauders is like, you know, all the young dudes, it still has the shape of the OG story of of Shakira's Harry Potter. If you think it's about matter, about what it's in it, you know, is it its original work because every single word, every single plank has been changed, every character has been adapted, then fan fiction is brand new original work. And I think the fact that like Hobbes wasn't satisfied he explained this in Of Identity and Difference, basically. The fact that he wasn't satisfied, he just poses these two answers and says, and I quote from his essay, "Wherefore the beginning of individuation is not always to be taken either from matter alone or from form alone," end quote. He wasn't satisfied by this binary divide of identity, because with this, he basically says that identity of a person or a text or something is not all form, all not, or matter. It is kind of both and neither. So in this eternal ship of Theseus situation that is fan fiction, I think we are asking on this episode that we give the same complexity and grace that we give people's identity to extend it to fan fiction.
And then I think to take it even one step further, because we've been discussing translation as an act of transformativity in this episode, and let me quote the most probably well-known contemporary analysis of the act of translation, which is from Babel by R.F. Kuang, or Babel if you're in this country, the UK. And I quote, "For how could there ever be an Adamic language? Language was just difference, 1,000 different ways of seeing, of moving through the world. No, 1,000 worlds within one, and translation, a necessary endeavor, however futile, to move between them," end quote. So we've argued that writing fan fiction is an act of translation and adaptation and a reshaping of the ship, if you will. A new ship, a adapted ship, the same ship, whatever you want to call it, And we've talked about how so many celebrated authors, popular books, upcoming releases all come from fan fiction or fan fiction writers, and how that all links to how the great works of literature throughout the English canon specifically that we've discussed, but honestly, like any literary canon that in any culture, and how they all share similar origins and practices as fanfiction. Because although fanfiction, as we've discussed, is like a worthwhile exercise for budding writers or writers in general, but it can also be the end goal in and of itself. Fanfiction, after all, is an act of translation and creation. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Gifted Child Symposium. We hope you found it interesting, thought-provoking, and if nothing else, amusing. Please leave a review on whatever your preferred podcast platform is, as it really helps us out. And if you really enjoyed, please share us with your friends. You can find us on Instagram at giftedcs.pod. We'd love to hear from you.
Just to mention her in every episode. My girlfriend literally called me out because she was like, you've spent like hours of your time talking about fanfiction, but not talked about smut. And it feels deliberate, but I swear it isn't, because the way the all of the fan fictions we're talking about that we love dearly are also low-key erotica. I feel like we need a whole other episode for that, but yeah, specific like fan fiction also like is so characterized by smut, and I don't think people realize how important that is. Like, first of all, fan fiction, like, let's be real, so many of us learned sex education through fan fiction. Like, I can tell you I was reading a Draco Genie. I never read any after that. I swear. I was just being 13. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it. But I was reading a fanfiction, that pair. And it became smut because fanfiction is just what it is. And I was 13. And I remember looking up the word orgasm because of that. Of that fanfiction. I was like, what is that? I wonder. Like, there's so much of fan fiction that, yes, misconceptions, but also so much I've literally met people who were homophobic until they read Dreary, and Dreary was the first seed that sparked them being like, maybe gay people are people. Like, I kid you not. It teaches wildly.
It does. I mean, I also got my sex education. Well, my first brushes with sex education through fanfiction. And for those of you who weren't on fanfiction.net, tags aren't a thing, so you can't see when shit has smut in it. But what people did do back in the day was say lemons or limes to refer to whether or not something had smut in it. Lemons being like smut, but limes being like extreme smut.
Yes. Which at this point is all of AO3.
Yes, exactly. And like, let's be real, like lemons and limes, a little bit of kissing, a little bit of, like whatever missionary sex, slippery slope to a lot more specific kinks that I may or may not have been into, but I read them, and now I know a lot of things about many things.
Yes. Same.
And I think we particularly wanted to like mention this because there's been such a rise in smut being mainstream with ACOTAR and romantasy on TikTok, and it's interesting that people are referring to it as like spicy romance or whatever, and it's not really quite considered erotica, even though it 100% is.
Yes. I just love, with the rise of fan fiction is also, I think, a rise of like more horniness. Like, let's go. I think it's so fun and cool that like at the margins of society we can be as horny as we want, and margins of society, I mean AO3. And like, talking about that, I also want to give my whole gratitude to fanfiction, because I learned how two women have sex through fanfiction. Like, I remember when I first started liking girls, I could not envision how two women would have sex, because all I was ever told was like heterosexual sex, basically. And through reading fanfiction, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That sounds fun. I could get into it. And generally, fanfiction and knowing the visuals and the mechanics of sex helped me legitimize my own attraction and my queerness. Like, thank you so much, fanfiction. This is why I fucking love Swan Queen. Let's go.
Yeah. And it's interesting that fanfiction, which is like the weird, nerdy, like, what's the word, like fringes of society, parts of the internet is what it is, has that reputation. And then you get shit like, I just finished reading The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which she recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is very erotic. I'll give it that. It has what some would characterize as smut in it, but God, is it not educational, nor is it empowering, nor is it hot. It was indeed just there. And it's like we were just having this discussion about how it's so weird, the stigma we put on explicit sex in book form particularly, but I guess it applies to movies too, where it's like if it's intended for you to be for the audience to be turned on by the sex scenes, then it's trashy, it's smut, it's porn, it's lowbrow. But if it's like uncomfortable or like not consensual, gritty, or whatever you want to call it, then it's highbrow. It's an interrogation on desire.
Yeah, it's Almodovar,
Yeah.
it's Nymphomaniac, it's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Like, it's almost like we can't enjoy sex. And I think, like, just like as a final thing on like this is so funny to do the postscript and still be like, actually fan fiction. But seriously though, we could talk more about the porn and the smut. Let us know if you want to hear that, because there's so much to say about the way that fan fiction depicts sex and how audiences like that, and like how audiences learn from that and readers and stuff. But I just want to say that like fan fiction is truly a space where enjoyable, empowering sex and also well-written stories and prose are like not mutually exclusive, even though probably like a lot of cinema and literature would like you to believe that. I think fan fiction is like living proof that they're both possible. And that's why I think it's almost like not even worth mentioning how much sex there is in all of these fan fictions we're talking about, because it's like, yeah, and it's good.